Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about books again. A couple of years ago, I put a video up on the channel called 13 Books for Gardnerian Seekers, where I provided a list of book recommendations for people who were interested in the Gardnerian tradition of Wicca. That book list was my actual recommended reading list for Seekers at the time. I am a person who makes reading lists, so I have a recommended reading list for pre-initiatory training, which I gave to the person that I was training at that time. I have a recommended reading list for first-degree initiates in the tradition. I have a recommended reading list for second-degree initiates. I have a recommended reading list for third-degree initiates. Those I have, like the second and third degree lists, I haven't had a chance to give to anyone because I haven't brought anyone to second or third degree yet, but I have the lists. They're ready for whenever I need them. I'm a person who makes reading lists. I like having a list of books that I can give to someone to say, here are things that you can read to help process the experiences that you're having. No training of any kind is just a matter of reading. You also have conversations and lectures and hands-on learning, no matter what you're learning, and that's true of Wicca as elsewhere. And also, Wicca in particular is highly experiential, so you can't learn Wicca out of a book, but I think that books can be useful ways of framing experiences for the kinds of people who really get a lot out of books. And of course, not everyone is a reader. Not everyone learns best by reading. So these are recommended rather than required reading lists. But importantly, I'm always updating my reading lists. I'm always going back and rereading the books that are on those lists, making sure that they still have the information that I think they have, that there aren't things I've forgotten about them, that they haven't aged poorly, or that there aren't other books that have come out more recently that maybe provide the same sort of information and do it in a way that I like better, right? There are constantly new books being released, and those new books have good information. And simultaneously, it's true that every book, no matter how good it is, goes out of date eventually. Every book is published at a moment in time and carries with it certain assumptions and conventions of the time when it was published. And 20, 30, 40 years down the line, some of those conventions start to fall away. And that's not to say that those books are no longer good or no longer worth reading, but they start to be worth reading more as historical artifacts and less as, this is the truth about what paganism is like now. So I think a really good example of this is Drawing Down the Moon, which was on my list of 13 books for Gardnerian Seekers. Drawing Down the Moon is a fabulous book. I highly encourage people to read it. But it was written in the 70s, and a lot of the organizations mentioned in Drawing Down the Moon no longer exist. It is no longer reflective of the landscape of contemporary paganism. There are also various, political and theological attitudes present in Drawing Down the Moon that are no longer really present in pagan discourse in the 21st century. Or conversely, there are conversations being had in 21st century pagan spaces that weren't being had in the 1970s and aren't present in that book. So it's still a very good book, it's still worth reading, but it's not, the holy grail of what the pagan community is like anymore, because the pagan community has changed and the book has not. And so I have updated my list of recommended reading for seekers of the Gardnerian tradition. And importantly, I have 8 books that I'm going to recommend today. All 8 of these books have been published within the 21st century. Some are more recent than others, but all of them are at least within the past 20 years. They're a little more up to date. They're also on a wide range of topics. My thinking about what I want people to get out of sort of a recommended reading list or a pre-initiatory training program have changed since I made the other 13 books video. So the 13 books for Gardnerian Seekers video contains a number of books that are really specifically about Wicca, about how to do Wiccan ritual. And increasingly, I'm of the mind that initiatory Wicca is so experiential that there's really very little point in trying to read about Wicca prior to initiation. Now, this is something that a lot of Coven leaders will disagree with me about, right? This is just my own take. Every Coven trains differently. But increasingly, I'm of the mind that when I'm working with someone in pre-initiatory training, I don't want to talk about Wicca, because anything I teach you is sort of going to be like a half-truth version of what we do, and there will be some things that might align with initiatory Gardnerian practice, but there will be other things that just don't, and I don't want to bother, teaching all of that and then unteaching that and reteaching a new version of initiatory Wicca post-initiation. It's just it's a whole mess. So instead, the books that I'm about to recommend today are books about various topics that are all relevant to the practice and experience of Gardnerian Wicca, but that aren't directly about Wicca. These are ritual skills, magical skills, books about theology and the gods, things like that, that are all going to bring to bear on the experience that someone might have post-initiation. So they're all relevant towards helping someone build toward that experience, but they're not about Wicca directly, because I personally am just not interested in doing Wicca as part of a pre-initiatory training program. Your mileage may and probably will vary. All 8 of these books are written by Gardnerian initiates who are out, who are public about being Gardnerian initiates. So, at the very least, what you're getting with these books is a variety of perspectives on important topics in magic and religion that are provided by Gardnerian initiates. No two initiates agree about every single thing, so it's important to me that people have access to a variety of different perspectives from initiates sort of all over the world. So it's important to me that people see voices from Gardnerian initiates that sometimes overlap and contradict each other, because Wicca is experiential, and the most important thing is that people be primed on how to engage with these experiences that they're having in ritual, whether those are religious experiences, magical experiences, or somewhere in between. Without further ado, let's just dive into the books. The first book, going in alphabetical order by author, is The Wheel of the Year, Your Nurturing Guide to Discovering Nature's Seasons and Cycles by Rebecca Beattie. This is a fabulous book. This was published, I think, last year. I think this is a very recent book. Rebecca is a Gardnerian priestess living in the UK, and this is just a beautiful, simple, practical, down-to-earth guide to the Wheel of the Year, the 8 Sabbats, the general sort of tides of the seasons. It has a little bit of English folklore for each of the Sabbats, right? It's written from a very English perspective. Books about the Wheel of the Year kind of inevitably are confined to a particular locality because the climate is different everywhere in the world. So, for example, most English books about Imbolc will talk about it as the start of spring. I have never known Imbolc to be the start of spring. Imbolc is the dead of winter where I live and everywhere I have ever lived. Imbolc is the coldest, harshest part of the year. So there are things in this book that are specific to the English climate that won't necessarily align with your experience if you live in other climates. But I think Rebecca Beattie does a really beautiful job of just explaining the themes associated with each of the Sabbats, how they link together, how they tell a coherent story. She gives a little bit of solitary ritual and some sort of practical exercises that can be done at each of the Sabbats. So I think this is just a really nice, solid introduction to the Wheel of the Year. The one thing about this book that doesn't connect to me is that Rebecca has a planetary series of correspondences with the Wheel of the Year. So she assigns each Sabbat on the wheel to a particular one of the 7 classical planets in astrology. So the 2 solstices she associates with the sun, and then each of the remaining 6 Sabbats is associated with one of the other planets. Astrology doesn't factor into my experience of Wicca. I have a video about that, which I'll try to link up here. But this planetary set of correspondences, if you're interested in it, may well work for you. So, book number 1. Book number 2 is Neopagan Rites by Isaac Bonewits. This is just a fabulous book about doing ritual in general. It's a guide to making pagan ritual in a way that works, and in a way that works theologically, but also in a way that works practically, where people are going to, be enjoying themselves, where people are going to be engaged and have something to do. People aren't going to be standing in line for most of the ritual, because standing in line is the death of a good ritual experience. So this book outlines the various steps of most ritual, most religious ritual, particularly in a pagan context, and then talks through the performance of each of those steps and practical considerations like the size of the group, accommodating for disabilities, and making sure that you are able to run an effective ritual that leaves people feeling like they connected to the divine in an important and meaningful way. It's a really fabulous book, and it won't teach you the specifics of Wiccan ritual, although there is some discussion of Wiccan rituals as, like, among the examples here. But it will teach you ritual skills that are transferable to any ritual context, and I think those are really good skills to bring into a Wiccan circle, sort of post-initiation. In recommending a book by Isaac, I should briefly talk about the allegations of abuse that came forward in, I want to say, 2017. Marion Zimmer Bradley's daughter was the victim of horrific sexual abuse at the hands of her parents. Marion Zimmer Bradley was involved in the wider pagan community and overlapped with a lot of important pagan figures. Back in, like I said, I think it was 2017, she, the daughter, published a book, a memoir about some of her experiences, which included allegations that Isaac Bonewits had participated in her sexual abuse. It is a complicated and messy situation. I will link the Wild Hunt reporting of the allegations down below. She alleged that Isaac had abused her in a place and at a time where we know that Isaac and she were never in the same place. So she claims that she was abused when she was living in Diana Paxson's home. We know that Isaac and she were never in that home at the same time. Trauma does strange things to people's brains, so who knows, right? Like, I don't know any of these people personally. I never met Isaac. It is an ugly and messy and terrible situation. You are an adult and you are able to decide for yourself. I know that some people might not be comfortable reading a book by him because of these allegations. My personal stance is that even if you believe the allegations, he is dead and can't materially benefit from you buying the book. But everyone is going to feel differently about that, so exercise your own personal judgment. But I just, like, it would have felt weird to recommend the book and not talk about that. Moving on. The next book we're going to recommend is, God, I feel like such an inflated asshole here. My own book, Queen of All Witcheries, a biography of the goddess. This comes out in June of 2023. I am so proud of this little book. This is a book about the goddess who is worshipped in traditional Wicca, but also the goddess who is sort of known as the goddess across the broader pagan movement, New Age, and so on. And it's not just about who the goddess is, it's also about some of the history of the modern development of goddess worship. So setting aside questions of ancient paganism, and thinking about the very specific modern revival of goddess worship that started in about the mid-19th century, and who the important figures were, the thinkers, the religious movements, the occult practitioners that shaped the way we think about the goddess today. This book also has lots and lots of rituals and practical exercises just to help people connect to the goddess alongside talking in the more theoretical terms about those historical aspects. I love this book. I'm so proud of this book. And honestly, there is no other book like this. There are a lot of excellent books about the goddess that have been written in the past. Most of them sort of up through the late 90s, and then the publishing boom about the goddess really cut off in the 2000s. But most of the really good books about the goddess have two major flaws. The first is just a woeful gender essentialism, right? There's a whole lot of like, the goddess is womb power, and if you have a womb, you are a goddess, and if you don't have a womb, you cannot worship the goddess, and that is, A, just blatantly transphobic, but B, it's part of a particular 20th century feminist polemic that is no longer really the way that feminist spaces or pagan religious spaces like to think about gender, because it's very essentializing even for cis women, right? You know, cis women are nurturing and intuitive and cyclical and emotional because they have wombs, and they're not rational or linear or warlike or like, and people are complicated, and everyone is all of those things. So the essentialist rhetoric of particularly the back half of the 20th century, really worked its way into a lot of books about the goddess in a way that is just outdated to read now. So I wanted to provide a book that updated a little bit of that. And then the other thing that is sort of the cardinal sin of goddess books up through the early 2000s is there's just a lot of bad history in those books. There's a lot of bad pseudo-historical claims that we now know to be false. And so I wanted to write a book that I could hand to people about the goddess and say, like, hey, here's a book about the goddess, about who she is, about where her worship came from, without having to add a dozen different qualifications of, like, oh, well, you know, they ignore all of chapter 3 because we know that that archaeological research is bunk, and, you know, so on. So, deeply proud of this book. Very, very excited about it. Please read this book. It is available for pre-order now. Not to do too much self-promotion, but pre-orders really help a book, and I would love this book to do well. So please consider pre-ordering this book, or if you're watching this video after the book has been released in June of 2023, please consider buying the book, and leave me a review on Amazon and do all those other things, because this book is great, and I want people to read it. Next book is one that was on my previous reading list, so I haven't abandoned all of the 13 books from the last video. This is In Search of the New Forest Coven by Philip Heselton. I won't talk too much about this book because I've talked about it in the other video. It's a very good book in that Heselton has done a great deal of original research and really plausibly identified people who were probably involved in the New Forest Coven, how they came together, the way that they thought about what they were doing, and there's really good information in here, right? He's talked about the idea that these are people who came together with the idea that they had been witches together in a past life, and that they were trying to reconstruct what they thought that witchcraft might have looked like in their past life together. There is a lot of speculation in this book that makes me uncomfortable. Heselton doesn't always hold himself to the burden of proof that I would like him to hold himself to, but the information in this book is nonetheless unparalleled, and it provides an excellent insight into the origins of Wicca, the early days of Wicca, and sort of how people at the start of this religion were thinking about what it was. So, very, very good book. The next book is one that I have talked about not just in the 13 books for Gardnerian Seekers video, but also elsewhere on the channel. This is Magical Power for Beginners by Deborah Lipp. It's a great book. It's just a good book about how to do magic. It's particularly about the kind of magic that I do. So, there are various approaches to magic. This is about a kind of sympathetic magic that is the type of magic I most often use and most often see used in Wiccan spaces. So if you're looking for a foray into magic and into the kind of magic you might encounter in Wicca, this is a really excellent book. And, like, as with any book, there are certain things in this book that I disagree with. Deborah provides a gendered account of the magical tools that has never sat entirely well with me. But for the most part, it's just a really good, practical, hands-on account of how to do magic. So, next item on the list is Outside the Charmed Circle by Misha Magdalene. This is a really excellent introduction to, not even an introduction to, it's a primer on thinking about the complicated issues of gender, sexuality, and consent as they exist in magical spaces. Misha is a Gardnerian initiate, but she's also a fairy initiate, Victor Anderson fairy witchcraft. And these days, I think most of her magical practice is more fairy than it is Gardnerian. But she has some really interesting perspectives, I think, just on, like, what these things are, like, what gender is, what sexuality is, what consent is, how do these things fit together in mundane spaces, and then how does that transfer over into magical spaces. I think a lot of the time, we in magical or pagan religious communities like to imagine that we are unaffected by these, like, lowly political issues of like whatever is happening in broader discourse about, in this case, sexuality and gender, right? Like, we like to imagine that those are things that belong to the mundane world and they don't infringe upon our magical spaces. But the truth is they do, and we need to just, like, take the time to think about them and think about how they interact with our experience of magical practice. So I think Misha is just really good at asking these questions. Misha is trans. She does a beautiful job of explaining a lot of the, like, gender studies 101 for people who aren't familiar with a lot of the terminology, and then just posing the questions and talking about, like, how does your experience of your gender interact with your magical identity? How do you think about consent in magical spaces? With other practitioners, or maybe with the spirits or gods that you're interacting with? Like, those are good questions to be asking. And I think this is a really good book to prime people to think about how they might answer those questions. The next book I'm going to recommend is The Horned God of the Witches by Jason Mankey. This is the best book I have ever read about the Horned God. It's a must-read. If you're interested in working with the Horned God, however you might know him, right, whether you're practicing more of a traditional witchcraft approach and you think of this as the man in black or the devil, or whether you're practicing more of a Wiccan approach to magic and witchcraft, if you are interested in interacting with this figure who goes by many names and many identities and wears many hats, this is a must-read book. It's just excellent. There are a lot of rituals here. He talks about several of the sort of most important deities or folkloric figures that sort of came together and coalesced to form this understanding that we have of the Horned God. So figures like Pan, Cernunnos, the devil. He also talks about sort of more modern pagan interpretations like the Green Man and Ellen of the Ways. And it's an excellent, informative book with a lot of practical advice on how to construct ritual to connect to the Horned God and have experiences with the Horned God. It has a lot of Mankey's own personal experiences in there. It's just a wonderful book. So, highly recommended this book. And then the last book on our list is also from the 13 Books for Gardnerian Seekers video, and that is Traditional Wicca, A Seeker's Guide by Thorn, Mooney. I know I said that none of the books on this list were actually about Wicca, and lo and behold, this one has Wicca in the title. But this is not a how-to book about Wicca. There is no actual Wicca in this book. This is a book rather about if you have been practicing on your own for a while and you're potentially interested in traditional Wicca, how might that experience be structured and how might it be different from your solitary practice? So, what is it like to approach a coven, right? Like, what is the point of a coven? What is the point of magical lineage or magical initiation? And those are, I think, really good questions to be asking as a seeker coming into the Gardnerian tradition or any other tradition of Wicca for that matter. So Traditional Wicca is a fabulous book that helps orient people toward thinking about approaching traditional Wicca and getting an understanding in very broad terms of what they might be able to expect out of that experience. But there's no actual description of Wicca, there's no actual Wiccan practice in this book, which is why I sort of included on this list of things that I say aren't really, like, books on Wicca. To be clear, like, I'm not saying, like, I'm not saying that Thorn Mooney lied to you and didn't really write a book about Wicca, right? It's a book about Wicca, but it's not a how-to book, is kind of the distinction that I'm trying to make. Again, I've talked about this book in my other video, so go check that out if you want more detail about my thoughts on it. But it's a wonderful book, and it really holds up. So, there are my 8 recent books for Gardnerian Seekers, all of them published in the 21st century. I think Neopagan Rites is the oldest of them. Most of the others are pretty recent. Most of the others, I want to say, are like in the past 6 years. But anyways, I really love all of these books. I still love all of the books on my other reading list, right? So I have, the Witch's God and the Witch's Goddess by Janet and Stuart Farrer are on my other reading list. Those remain very good books about the gods. Drawing Down the Moon is on my other list. That remains a very good book. But all of those books are older and are in some ways a little outdated. And that's not to say that they're not worth reading, because they absolutely are. But you want to read them with a historical eye. As opposed to the books that I've recommended here, which I'm recommending more with a, like, practical and informative how-to, here's what you need to know experientially in order to sort of prime yourself for approaching Gardnerian initiation. Anyways, I have rambled long enough. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy these books. If you have other recommendations or if you have thoughts about the books I've recommended, please feel free to leave your comments down below, and I will catch you on the flip side. Bye.